Carlos. Today I will be presenting my analysis of the two stories, Taste and Swim. First, we will be doing an index. So first we will be talking about both stories, and we will be developing a plot line, the conflict, the theme and topics, and an imagery. And in some cases, the tone as well.
Okay, so, it all begins at the dinner in London, in Mike Schofields' house with his family and his guest Richard Pratt. The narrator begins to explain that Richard Pratt is called an epicure, and that he is a fanatic of food and wine and knows a lot about it, and that he has this society that is called the Epicures, in which he sends out monthly information about wine and food. The narrator begins to explain that every time that Richard Pratt would come over to dinner at Michael's house, it would always be an extravagant meal, and that they would always have this small game where they would bet. So Mike would bring out a special wine, and Richard Pratt would have to guess what year it was from and where it was cultivated, like the vineyard, and also which country and part it was from. So then comes the rising action. So the dinner actually begins, and Richard Pratt begins to flirt with Mike's 18-year-old daughter, Louise. And Louise looks terrified, and Mike notices that, Richard Pratt isn't paying that much attention to him or the dinner, so he decides to present the first wine. Mike talks about, then Richard Pratt ignores the wine and guesses it quickly. And we assume that Mike is shocked, and he talks about presenting the second wine. So they present the second wine, and he talks about his special place where they leave wines, which is in the studio, a place where Richard Pratt had suggested to leave the wine, so it would be perfect room temperature. So Mike begins to have a very confident look, and he begins to say that, nobody would be able to guess where his wine could be from, because, he wouldn't even be able to know where it was from unless he, looked at it before. And then he initiates the bet, and he says to Richard Pratt, that if he would not like to bet, that it would be completely okay, and as, asserting dominance in a way, and politely telling him that, he was more cultured than Richard Pratt. So both men begin to politely bicker, and they start betting. So they start betting, and Mike appears to be very confident, and Richard would never guess where the wine is from, and he says that he could bet anything to Richard, and then Richard bets Louise's hand in marriage. So, of course, Mike disagrees, and they begin to negotiate and settle that if Richard loses, Louise would get 2 of his properties. And Mike says that it's Louise's decision, and he pressures her into saying yes, because he says that, he could buy her a fortune. So then, the servant brings the wine. Mike looks very calm and relaxed and confident, and Richard begins to answer where he thinks the wine is from. At first, he said that it is obviously a Medoc, which is a part of France. And he says that he begins saying if maybe it was from Margaux, but he says no. And then he says maybe Pauliac, and he says also no. And then he says that it is unmistakably a Saint-Julien, which is a part of Medoc. And so then he says that there are many places where it could be in Saint-Julien. And so he was thinking about the producers in Saint-Julien. And he drinks a little bit more wine, and then he says, okay, it could be from Bechevel, and he says that it is completely from Bechevel. He says, could it actually be from Bechevel? And then he's like, no, it's not from Bechevel, not quite. And then he says that it could maybe be Talbot, which is another area. But then he takes another sip, and he says, no, it's not from Talbot. And he says, it's from Château Brenet-Durcru. And Mike, at this point, is a little bit skeptical and afraid, and he actually seems afraid. And then Richard reveals the year, which is 1934. Mike asks him if that is his final answer, and he says yes. At this this moment, everyone is pressuring Mike to turn the bottle around and show if the bottle is actually from where Richard Pratt had said it was from. And at this very moment, the servant interrupts and gives Richard back his glasses and says, "Sir, your glasses are here. You left them in the studio where the wine bottles were resting." And that is the moment where everyone realizes that Richard Pratt had gone to see where the wine bottles were from, and that's why he was winning the bets, which meant he was dishonest and a farce. And that's where the story ends.
So now we're going to keep on going with the taste conflict. So I found that there are two conflicts in the story. First is person versus person, and then person versus self. I believe that the conflict is person versus person on one side because there is this unspoken rivalry between Mike and Richard to show who knew more about wine and food, which basically meant that they had better taste. And that is based on a cultural, a societal, stereotype. And it would look like they were from a higher class. And it was kind of like both men were trying to assert dominance to each other. By politely bickering and by showing off who knew more about wine and who was more cultured and knew more. It's like they were fighting to show who had more knowledge. And then the other conflict I found was person versus self, and this is where it's almost as if they weren't only proving others and each other, but they were proving themselves to see who was better and more had better taste, and based on the stereotypes that society has set, which really good taste is subjective to every person, but they were trying to fit in and try to make themselves believe that they had this very great and big taste. So that, on the other hand, is their big pride is considered, the conflict of the story. Comes the taste, theme, and topics. So, in my perspective, the theme is a good taste based on society's stereotypes. And I think that the entire story, silently revolves around good taste and what is considered good and bad taste. And really trying to show that good taste is subjective, and also trying to show honesty in a way. So I think the topics that could go along would be wine tasting, money, gambling, ambition, and honesty. Now, wine tasting because it showed in a way that they had culture, and that's basically what they thought about. Money because in a way they thought that by showing that they had more money, that made them higher class. And then gambling because, of course, the entire deal was a bet, so it is part of gambling. Ambition because they were both ambitious to show who was better than the other. And honesty because at the end, Richard Pratt wasn't honest, and the only one who was really honest in the game was Mike. Shovey. I found that one of the most important aspects of the story was the imagery. It gives much better understanding of the story, and it completely helps develop the events and reveal that Michael Pratt was a farce. Now I'm saying this because I think that it helps completely describe each person in the story. So it would describe Louise also in the way that he used the tone. And it would also help understand how, where they were leaving the wine in the studio, and how everything worked. And they were also describing each person, when they described the servant. And also it also helps with the figures of speech, and it helps develop the other literary elements, which the personification, because Richard Pratt would always try to explain wine as if it were a person, and so it would say oh, this is such a very gentle wine, shy but gentle, and he would always try to explain wine as a person. So I think that's why imagery was very important in the story.
Okay, so now we're going to begin with the plotline of A Swim. So the exposition. It all begins with lots of sailors in a sailboat. And the weather was really bad, and it was around dinner time. Mr. Boatybull had asked the purser of when the captain would make, his would announce his estimate of for the auction, and the purser said, well, he didn't know. And then he began asking the purser if, the weather would delay and make that the boat went slower and didn't go as fast. And the purser said that it probably would come a storm, and it probably would be pretty bad and slow down the boat a lot. So the Mr. Boatybull begins to make all these calculations in his head, and he begins to say that if he could make the auction correctly and he would win the bet, he could buy this new car and arrive back home and show his wife that he had won this new car and bought this new fabulous car. So then begins the rising action. The captain announces the estimate of 830 miles until the next day. The auction begins, and so they begin to explain the low field and high field. The low field means that it's below average of what the captain says, so below 830 miles the day, and the high field is over 830 miles the day. So Mr. Boatybull begins to bits at 820 for 200 pounds, and he had said that these 200 pounds had been his last 2 years' savings, and that he could never lose it. He was very confident that the boat would only do 820 miles because there was a storm coming, the weather wasn't as good, and the boat wouldn't move as fast. So then he decides and he calmly goes to bed. The climax is he's very relaxed and goes to bed. The next morning, he wakes up and he realizes that the weather is cleared up and the water was very still, which means that the boat would probably go a lot faster in the water. He realizes he was going to lose the bet, and he was going to lose his 2 years' savings, and that his wife was going to be very mad at him. He thinks that he has to get a way of getting out of this and getting out of the situation, and that he doesn't want to affront it. And so he thinks he can just stop and make the boat go backwards so it could save him a little bit more time. He decides that he thinks of a plan and decides to jump off and pretend to fall in order to buy him time, so that a person would know and then tell the captain that they would have to go back because a passenger fell. So then comes the rising action. He decides to dress as if he were to go do sports in the dock because he decides that he has to find something comfortable to swim in. He goes out to the deck and he sees this old fat lady. He thinks that maybe she might have eye problems or hearing problems, so he decides to go check and see if, she's a nice lady that would actually look for help. He goes on and he begins to say that, if she was at the auction, she says, no, I go to bed very early. And so he says, well, I'm going to get my sports in, and he decides to go. He decides to then proceed to jump off, and he screams, help. So the fat lady sees him, but she doesn't really know how to react. And in that same moment, another woman comes back and talks to the fat lady and tells her, oh, I haven't seen you all day. Where have you been? The fat lady tells that she saw this man, Mr. Boatybull, jump off the rail of the boat. And the other woman doesn't believe her and says it's nonsense. And the fat lady just knows completely that man fell off, but she thought it was just nonsense and that she was just seeing things. So the man at the end doesn't end up being rescued, and he ends up probably drowning, but that's when the story ends.